In this video, we're going to discuss a concept that I'm sure a lot of you have been curious about if you've been working with a lot of the tools on GTO Wizard. It's going to be how to build ranges. So if you're looking to dig into the theoretical concepts behind how we build well-rounded strategies in a variety of spots, you've come to the right place. Let's dive in. Now, in order to do this, we have to break things down a little bit. So I'm going to break it into two main categories of types of ranges that we're going to see. The first is going to be aggressive ranges. And this, of course, is going to be anytime we're betting or raising. Fairly straightforward. The other one is going to be defensive ranges. Now, you note that I haven't called these passive ranges because a defensive range isn't always going to be passive. But it is going to be a range that is facing some kind of aggression. So facing a bet or a raise. And of course, it includes any time we're checking or calling as well, including checking against no bet. So just checking behind or checking out a position on the flop, let's say. So first, let's tackle aggressive ranges. And the first question we have to ask here is, what is the goal of an aggressive range? In order to construct a good range, we have to know what our goals are and what our incentives are strategically. So that's where we start. Well, the main goal of an aggressive range is pretty simple. It's to maximize the rate at which our value hands are able to get paid off across all possible future street runouts, as well as, of course, the current street. And this seems fairly simple, but it's actually a complex process because it really relies on understanding where the threshold is, where our hands go from being value to being not quite strong enough to be value. And of course, understanding the rate at which we're going to get paid off, how big we're going to get paid off, and so on. But really, it's about maximizing the EV of our value hands. Now, there are three basic types of aggressive range that exist. There's going to be polar, there's going to be merged, and there's going to be linear. And the best way to define each one is in terms of where the EV of that range comes from. Because understanding the sources of EV for our range, understanding where our range is deriving EV from, is going to help us to build the range effectively and understand what aspects we have to keep in mind when we're doing that. Now, our first topic here is polar ranges. With polar ranges or polarized ranges, we have two very clear EV sources. One part of the range is going to capture EV by value betting, which is getting called by worse hands. And the other part of the range is going to capture EV by bluffing, which is getting better hands to fold. Now, on the river, this is easier to define than it is on the earlier streets because there's a lot murkier definitions of hand EVs on the earlier streets. But on the river, it's a lot easier. Now, you'll note here that the other part, being the bluffing part, I've mentioned that it captures EV by bluffing. Well, in fact, all it really does is prevent itself from losing EV by bluffing. The bluffing part of our polar range breaks even on the river. It doesn't profit. But that break-even bluff allows our value bets to profit. And that's how our polar range is going to function. Our second category of aggressive ranges here is going to be merged ranges. Now, these ranges exist almost exclusively on the earlier streets and have multiple different sources of EV. A merged range is going to include strong value hands, some thinner value hands, a variety of different types of draws, and some weaker bluffs. And it's usually going to include at least some hands which exist mostly to provide future street board coverage into our range, or which primarily benefit from equity denial and just getting hands to fold out that have 30 or 40% equity. Now, you'll note that I haven't included linear ranges specifically as a separate slide, and the reason is because linear ranges are essentially a merged range without the bottom part. A linear range is a range that includes all the top stuff and a lot of middle stuff, but no real bluffs, no definitive, obvious bluff hands. That's a linear range. And there are only going to be certain types of spots where it exists, so it's less important to understand that than it is to understand the nature of a merged range where some hands are capturing EV in multiple different ways. Now, here's when we get into the key question of this video. How do we actually build a range here? Well, building a polar range on the river is quite easy. It's one of the simplest range construction processes that exist. We have value and we have bluffs. And our value region is going to begin at the point where we think we can get called by worse more often than we get called by better. And it's going to progress upwards. Everything better than a certain hand strength is going to want to bet for value. Our bluffs are usually going to be hands without much or any equity to win at showdown because we don't need to always turn showdown value hands into bluffs. They're going to have positive EV as a showdown hand. Therefore, turning them into a break-even bluff is not really ideal. And we're going to prioritize having some kind of blocking power over our opponent's calling range, or failing that, unblocking power over the hands that are folding. We don't want to be blocking any of the folds. So it's a fairly simple construction. Now I'm going to shift over to an example from GTO Wizard AI just to show you the basics of how these polar ranges are constructed for a simple spot. So this is our first example here of a polar range construction on the river. This one is fairly straightforward. It's an MTT spot, 873, 2 spades flop with 50 big blind effective stacks, hijack open, big blind call, and chip EV ranges. You can see that hijack bets 82% here on the flop, which is a 3E size, geometric size, big blind calls, turn deuce of clubs, check, 82%, and call, so a 2E size there, and then river king of diamonds, check, and all in for 83%. So a 3-street geometric strategy here on this run out. I've picked it specifically because geometric strategies are really good for illustrating polar ranges. And as you can see, the range construction here on the river from the in-position player is quite simple and quite straightforward in that it's very much going to be this region here for value. So everything, even second pair plus in some cases, everything you can see basically queen 8 plus, that is the region that is strong enough to value bet all in for 83% here. And then all of the good hands and weak hands categories are checking. And then the trash hands are forming some of the bluffs. So a lot of queen highs, a lot of 6 high, 5 high, some ace highs as well. But basically, the bluffs are being drawn from pretty much a lot of the weakest hands in the range that actually arrive at this river. And you can see a very clear construction of a polar range there. It's everything above a certain strength of hand, and then a lot of bluffs that are primarily composed of hands that can't really win at showdown. If we sort by equity here, as you can see, the hands that have the weakest equity, 0 equity here for 5-4 of spades, and so on. Everything that has less than 4% equity is bluffing 100% of the time. There are a couple of hands that have about 4%, like the Jack 10, that are not bluffing as much. Queen 10, about 4%. Most of the Queen high or worse has 5% equity or so and is still bluffing. And then once we get to maybe 6%-ish, we're starting to check a bit more, 6.5%. And then only when we get to like 7% plus, this ace-jack-ish and better, that's where we start to check. So definitely pretty relevant here that everything that has 6% or less is basically betting. And there's a tiny bit of some bluffing here with stuff that has as much as 9%. But then once you get beyond ace-high, you've got 12% equity for ace-deuce, which has bottom pair. But then you've got 38% equity with 10-7. And there's no reason to bet a hand that has that much equity. So much EV attached to just checking back with 10-7 here. There's no reason to turn it into a bluff. So we're just betting with a very polar range, fairly simple construction, and not too much to say there in terms of complexity. So that's what a polar range looks like on the river. But of course, we're going to sometimes have polar ranges on the flop or on the turn as well. But since we have to factor in coverage over the remaining streets, we never have to construct a truly polar range on the flop or even the turn. We're not going to be truly polar until the river, but we can come pretty close, especially on a lot of fairly static board textures or brick turn cards where no card on the river or no card on the turn is particularly likely to change the board to any significant extent. But remember here that a range of value bets and draws is not a polarized range. If the draws have good equity, it's actually quite a linear range. It's a range of high equity hands and medium equity hands. That's pretty linear. It's not really very polar. It's very important to remember that. Now, when it comes to pre-flop, we're not often going to have that many situations where we do have a truly polar range pre-flop, but it will happen in certain instances, and particularly in spots where post-flop play is not going to happen particularly often from that point onwards. So after the post-flop SPR gets down to the point where if someone did call, it would be a very low SPR spot. And this is usually going to be the last bet before the all-in. So in ICM spots, it might be the 3-bet, but a lot of the time it's going to be the 4-bet, the 5-bet at deeper stacks, and so on. And polar pre-flop ranges are usually going to be very heavily blocker focused, with a lot of ace-x and king-x hands. That's going to be the defining factor, and sometimes we're going to want to have a low card too to unblock some of the raise folding hands. So hands like king 3 off, for example, can sometimes be in a polar 3-bet range. Now, the only other thing we need to consider here is how to build a merged range on the flop. A merged flop betting range is usually going to occur when we're not range betting in a certain spot. We're not betting every single hand because that's going to be a linear range. It goes from top down. But we're also not using a particularly large bet size. We're not overbetting. Maybe we're betting 2/3 pot, 3/4 pot, something like that. And the easiest way to grasp merged ranges is that we're usually going to want to bet at least some hands from every hand class or category. That means we're going to bet most of our strong hands, but not all of them. We're going to want to check a couple of strong hands from time to time. And we're going to check most of our middle hands, but not all of them. We're going to find some middle hands to bet. And then our weaker hands, it's going to vary from spot to spot, but quite often we're going to bet a lot of those too, because we want that element of polarity in there in the merged range. It's just we don't want it to be completely polar. We want to have some of those middle strength hands in there as well. So that's how those merged ranges are going to function. And now let's take a look at an example of one of these merged range situations in action. So now let's look at an example of a merged range betting the flop, a merged range playing aggressively on the flop. This is actually the same spot that we looked at earlier on, except now we're scrolling back to the flop. And as you can see, there's a lot of merging going on here because we're not able to distinctly identify polarity in the betting range. We've got a lot of this strong stuff is betting at a high frequency, but second pair is betting about half the time. Third pair is betting about a quarter of the time. And then the bluffs are also varying their frequencies as well. This V shape is what you're going to see quite often in a merged construction here. You're going to see this, maybe something in this area. You're going to see the best hands betting more often, but the good hands, weak hands, and trash hands all betting at various different frequencies. And this is to make sure that the board coverage still exists in the betting range going forward. We're using an 82% size here, so we're not going super huge with our sizing. And it's very important with that size that we maintain board coverage. We can't afford to be in a situation where our range is far too draw heavy, because that would result in an EV loss on the turns where we just wouldn't be able to bluff anymore when a flush gets there and so on. And then conversely, we don't want our range to be too weak because we don't want to get to the flush card turn with no flushes at all. So naturally speaking, the answer there, of course, is that we have to mix certain hands. And constructing with a mixed range is going to be pretty tricky. It's going to be difficult for us to implement without actually randomizing. But the first step is to understand how the range is actually constructed. And as you can see here, there's a very clear trend when it comes to these merged ranges, which is that we are betting some hands from every category. It's just we're not betting all of them. And even though we're betting at a reasonably high frequency of 68% here, the only category of hand that's actually always checking is low pair, and that's exactly pocket deuces. So pocket deuces is literally the only hand, or the only category of hand, that always checks here. And there's only one other hand, in fact, 9-7 suited, that's playing pure check, and even that's not even pure check. It's not even 100%. So definitely some mixing going on, but you can see how this merged range concept is functioning here. Now let's move on to looking at defensive ranges. Now, again, we come back to the main question. What's the goal of a defensive range? Well, let's find out. The primary goal of a defensive range is to simply maximize the equity realization of the hands which are too strong to fold, but too weak to justify playing aggressively. So they're getting a decent price. They don't want to, just be out of there, fold, and not realize any equity, but they don't have the strength to be able to raise against a particularly strong opposing range. And with this in mind, there's really two types of defensive range. There's a completely linear one and a condensed one. Now, a linear defensive range is going to come in any situation where our strategy only has one continuing range. So that's going to mean if we're doing either a fold or one other action. So if we're playing 3-bet or fold versus a certain raise, if we're playing call or fold versus a certain bet, then our defensive range is going to be purely linear. It's going to start at the top and it's going to work its way down until a certain strength of hand cannot justify continuing and we start folding. So those spots are actually very simple, but a more complex spot is where our defending range is condensed. That means it's going to be accompanied by a more polar aggressive range where a lot of our strongest hands and some bluffs are going to choose to play aggressively, but then that defensive range is going to choose to play passively, it's going to call, and it's going to be a little bit more condensed into medium strength hands with not as much strong stuff and not as much weak stuff. That's the spots that get really challenging. So let's first take a look at a couple of examples of linear defensive ranges, and then we'll move on to some more complex condensed ones. So this is a quick example here of a linear defensive range. What this is a cash game situation with high rake, no limit 50, 6 max, simplified ranges. And you can see the buttons opening to 2.5 bigs here. And the small blind only has a 3-bet to 12 and a fold. This is a defensive range that is purely linear because it starts at the top and it works its way down. Now, there is an element of board coverage in there, so you could maybe make an argument that this was a somewhat merged range. But there isn't anything in this range that is definitively identifiable as a pure bluff in that it's only getting its EV from getting folds. Everything is getting some of its EV from post-flop playability. So whenever we're playing a strategy where we don't have a calling range, we just have a defending range that's aggressive, this is a linear construction, and that's going to make sense here for this defensive range that we're going to employ. Now, by contrast, this next spot is a cash game situation where we get a 2.5 big blind open from the cutoff with no limit 500 rake, and then we get a small blind 3-bet. The cutoff calls, and we get to this flop of ace, king, king, 2 spades. The small blind is going to range bet for 20% here, and as you can see, the cutoff plays a purely linear defensive strategy here that includes no raises. This is not a good board for the cutoff. They have to do a lot of folding even to this 20% size. A lot of hands are mixing, and as you can see, they are not playing any raises. So this, once again, is linear in the sense that it starts at the top and works its way down, except this range also has to be concerned a little bit about board coverage, and that's why maybe they're not necessarily just calling 10s and 9s and 8s and then folding all the lower pairs. It's because 10s and deuces are actually functionally not that different here, and being able to turn a full house on any possible turn card is actually quite important. So it's not purely linear in its continuation, but you can see very clearly that every hand above a certain level of equity, everything in the weak hands category or above, is always continuing. And it's only hands that are in the trash hands category that are mixing calls and folds. So this is the same sort of concept. It's a binary strategy of call or fold, just like we saw raise or fold before, except now this is a linear defensive strategy that is purely playing a call to maintain that board coverage, and because it's a negative spot or a difficult spot for the in-position range. Now, the question here becomes, how do we construct a condensed defensive range? Well, the first thing to note is that we're almost always going to have some degree of protection within that condensed defensive range, because that range isn't going to want to be in a position where it's completely capped going forward and can just be exploited heavily by players firing in massive bets and forcing us to be indifferent with everything in our range. So while the majority of our strongest hands on earlier streets are often going to want to raise or continue aggressively, we should pick a small portion of our strongest hands to just call and protect that condensed defensive range. This protects us from future street aggression, it gives us a bit more board coverage, and it ensures we're not unnecessarily capped in various situations. So now we can look at an example of how that works. We can look at a practical situation where we would find it necessary to include a couple of strong hands in our check calling range as opposed to just raising all of them. And we'll also look at finding out where that boundary is going to be, of where we're going to start folding, and the rest of the hands are going to just continue. So this right here is a 40 big blind MTT spot where the button opens and the big blind is defending. And you can see that there is a polar 3-bet strategy here with the 9 big blind size. If we also look at the jams as well, and we just sort of factor that into the aggressive range here, we're not going to talk too much about adding in a jam as well as a polar 3-bet, but you can very much see that the hands that are playing aggressively here are either value hands or they are pretty much on the distinctive bluff side of the equation, like a lot of these blocker candidates in the bottom left of the screen. Now, by contrast, the calling range here, as you can see pre-flop, is actually completely condensed. There's no traps at this depth. There's no traps with aces or kings. There's no slow playing with strong pocket pairs. We're really purely playing 3-bets or shoves with 5s plus, and ace 10 suited plus, ace jack offsuit plus, king queen suited. So a lot of those strong hands just aren't ever really playing a call here. So this range is capped to a degree, and it's also bounded in the sense that we're not defending every single hand here. We are folding some hands, but it's condensed. It just happens to be wide, right? A condensed range is often pretty capped, but it's not going to be completely capped on every single board texture, because every board there are going to be at least some strong hands that we can flop here, given the nature of this range and the nature of how it's going to interact with all sorts of board textures. So you can see very much here that that polar 3-bet range is accompanied by a condensed defensive range, and that range is going to maintain a lot of board coverage, even though it's very, very wide. Now, when we actually proceed to the flop here in that same spot, the 40 big blinds, button versus big blind, flop is king jack 4, And this is an example here of a condensed defending range on the flop, because in this case, we're facing a small bet, and clearly we're going to call quite a bit. We've got about 50% frequency of calls here, but the raise size is fairly big at 67%, and the raising frequency is about 14%. It's higher than you might think here. If you look at how the raise is constructed, once again, we're seeing a lot of the king 9 plus good hands that are going to be raising, and then there's obviously going to be some bluffs. The best way to look at this is through the breakdown tab. If I look here, you can quite easily see that the hands at the top end of the scale here, the hands at the stronger end of the scale, are quite heavily favoring the raise option right there. And then the hands at the bottom end are going to be kind of diverse in terms of which hands are actually choosing to bluff. But everything in this area right here is choosing to bluff at some frequency, but there is a point where hands just purely fold. Now, by contrast, if we focus in on the calling range, it's largely going to be composed of hands that are pretty middling in equity. The top of the calling range, as we can see here, is going to be 2-pair. There's a little bit of 2-pair that's trapping here, so there is a little bit of protection in there, like I mentioned before. And a lot of the top pair is going to be calling too. Second pair, always calling. Third pair, mostly calling, and so on. So there is a little bit of protection, as you can see, but outside of that, it's mostly composed of hands that have the ability to continue, they have enough equity to continue, but they don't have enough incentive to raise because they're not strong enough, or maybe they don't have the right kinds of properties for bluffing. So when it comes to including bluffs in our range, clearly there are various different types of hands that are actually going to need to go in there, and that's going to be not just the weakest hands in our range. We're not going to construct a purely polar check raising here. We're not going to take, 9-5 with no heart and just blast off with it. But we are going to need to have some equity. So we're going to pick hands that maybe are going to be able to retain some flexibility on the turn after we get called, have options available in terms of what cards they're going to be able to barrel, and so on and so forth. So we're going to have various different types of hands in there. But you can see here the condensed nature of the calling range. If I highlight it right here, you can look at that quite clearly and see that there are a lot of hands in there that are really just focused around a couple of specific different categories. And that's not really a problem. We're facing a small bet. We're continuing with a condensed range. And a big chunk of our EV is coming from that aggressive range that is more polar. So this is the way a lot of these spots are going to shape up. So that's going to more or less wrap it for this video. Hopefully that was a really good guide for you guys. What I will leave you with, though, in terms of advice, is to make use of the Range Builder tool on GTO Wizard. It's your best friend, or at least it should be, because it's incredibly valuable to transform your approach to figuring out different strategies, especially when used in conjunction with GTO Wizard AI for custom solving of various different types of spots. If you're not already using it, I would highly recommend you build yourself a study process using the Range Builder going forward. Spend some time with it, figure out some of the spots that you're struggling with, and get yourself accustomed to that process of building ranges according to these ideas. Building polar or merged aggressive ranges, and then building some of these condensed defensive ranges and adding some protection in there to make sure you're not too capped. All of these things are going to be very relevant. So I would encourage you to use the Range Builder as much as you can and not just rely on the trainer. So that's going to be it for now. Thanks, everybody. As usual, you can check me out on my own personal YouTube channel at Poker Fluency. And of course, I'll be around on the GTO Wizard Discord to answer any questions that you have. In the meantime, there's another video right up here that you can check out, and I hope you will. Hope you enjoy that. Otherwise, I'll be back soon with another video, so good luck, everybody, and take care. Thank you.